Somewhere beneath the surface of this world, beneath the soil, beneath the rivers, beneath the accumulated weight of every century that has passed since human beings first learned to write things down, there is a civilization that history has never fully accounted for. Not lost in the ordinary sense, not buried under volcanic ash the way Pompeii was buried, waiting to be excavated by patient hands with careful brushes. Lost in a different way. Lost the way a frequency is lost when the receiver that was tuned to it is destroyed. The signal is still there, the transmission is still broadcasting, but the instruments capable of receiving it no longer exist, or almost no longer exist. Because there is one document, one extraordinary, almost incomprehensibly vast document that was composed specifically to preserve what those instruments once received. To hold the memory of a world so different from ours that even the people who lived at its edges, who caught only the last fading light of it before it passed entirely beyond their reach, struggled to find language adequate to describe what they had witnessed. That document is the Mahabharata, the longest epic ever composed by human hands. 100,000 verses, 10 times the length of the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. A text so large that the tradition itself says, "What is found here may be found elsewhere. What is not found here will not be found anywhere." Most people think of it as a war story, a family conflict scaled to mythological proportions, brothers against brothers, kingdoms against kingdoms, the end of an age told through the suffering of extraordinary people. But that is only its surface. Beneath the surface, the Mahabharata is something else entirely. It is a map of a civilization that existed before the world forgot it was possible. A civilization built not on stone or iron or the accumulation of territory, but on the direct, conscious, daily relationship between the human and the divine. This is what it reveals, and this is why it was preserved. Chapter 1. The World That Was. How the civilization of Dvapara Yuga looked. The Mahabharata was not composed as mythology. This is the first and most important thing to understand before we go any further. The people who composed it, and it was many people across many generations, building layer upon layer onto a core that may be as old as 5,000 years, did not sit down with the intention of writing legend. They were not crafting an allegory or constructing a philosophical framework dressed in narrative clothing. They were doing something much more specific, and in many ways, more urgent. They were describing a world they had either witnessed themselves or received from people who had. And that world, the world of the Mahabharata in its full, living, pre-war expression, was unlike anything that exists today in ways that go far beyond the presence of gods and heroes and magical weapons. It was different in its infrastructure, in its cities, in its roads, in the specific quality of its social organization, in the nature of the relationship between its rulers and the knowledge they governed, in the texture of ordinary daily life, which was saturated with the sacred in ways so normalized, so structurally embedded, that the people living within it would no more have thought to remark upon the sacred dimension of their world than we think to remark upon the presence of electricity in ours. It was simply there, everywhere, all the time, until it wasn't. Let us begin with the cities. The Sabha Parva, the second book of the Mahabharata, describing the great assembly hall of the Pandavas, contains architectural descriptions of such specificity and such extravagance that scholars have been arguing about them for centuries. Some dismiss them as poetic exaggeration, the natural tendency of epic literature to enlarge everything it touches. But there is a quality to these descriptions that does not read like exaggeration. It reads like testimony, like someone who was there or who received the account from someone who was there, trying to convey something real, using the limited vocabulary available for things that have no precedent. The Maya Sabha, the palace built for the Pandavas by Maya Danava, the divine architect who served the Asuras, is described in the Mahabharata with details that have no equivalent in any other literature of the ancient world. Its floors, the text says, were made of crystal so pure and so perfectly laid that they resembled still water. Guests at the court, unfamiliar with the building, would lift their robes when walking across certain sections, believing they were about to step into a pool. And they would stumble when walking over certain pools, believing the surface of the water to be solid floor. The illusion was perfect, not theatrical, structural, built into the very material of the palace in a way that was not intended to deceive, but simply reflected the extraordinary quality of the construction and the extraordinary properties of the materials involved. There were doors that were invisible when closed, so perfectly fitted to their frames, from materials so precisely matched to the surrounding walls that Duryodhana, on his visit to the palace, walked directly into several of them. And there were walls that appeared to be open passageways, transparent barriers of some described material that stopped him mid-stride when he attempted to walk through them. The palace contained gardens with trees that bore fruit in every season simultaneously, not through magic in the decorative sense, through a mastery of botanical knowledge and environmental engineering that the text describes as completely matter-of-fact, as one might describe a particularly well-designed irrigation system. The trees were simply managed by people who understood how to manage them, whose knowledge of living systems exceeded what we currently understand to be possible. Is this architecture metaphor? Is Maya Danava's palace a symbolic structure? Perfection as metaphor for divine order? Illusion as metaphor for Maya in the philosophical sense? Perhaps. The tradition supports both readings. But consider this. The Mahabharata is not a text that typically uses architectural metaphor. When it wants to make a philosophical point about Maya in the metaphysical sense, it does so directly, in the many discourses that are embedded throughout its 100,000 verses. It does not need to encode philosophy in building descriptions. When it describes a building, it generally means a building. And the Mayasabha is not the only building described this way. Hastinapura, the capital of the Kaurava kingdom, the city in which much of the Mahabharata's early drama unfolds, is described in terms that place it in a category entirely apart from any city we have evidence of in the ancient world. Its walls, the text tells us, were white and shining from a distance, visible to travelers approaching from a day's journey away. Its streets were wide enough for multiple chariots to pass each other without difficulty, not the narrow organic lanes of a city that grew over centuries without planning, but the broad, deliberate arteries of a city designed, intentionally, by people who knew in advance what a city of that scale and purpose would require. It had systems for the disposal of waste that the text mentions only in passing, almost incidentally, as if such systems were so normal as to require no explanation. It had granaries of a scale sufficient to supply the city through years of difficulty. It had halls of learning, not temples exactly, though the boundary between temple and academy was, in that world, far less distinct than it is in ours, where knowledge of every kind was maintained, transmitted, and expanded. And it had, at its center, structures dedicated not to the display of royal power, but to the maintenance of cosmic order. Places where the fire was kept continuously lit, where the rituals that the Vedic tradition understood to be necessary for the sustaining of the world's balance were performed not occasionally, not seasonally, but every day, without interruption, by specialists whose entire lives were devoted to the maintenance of that particular kind of knowledge. The Mahabharata describes at least a dozen major cities in its pre-war world. Each one is given specific characteristics, specific qualities of architecture and organization and spiritual function. This is not the generic city building of epic convention, the unnamed interchangeable cities that serve merely as backdrop for the action. These are places described as if the author cares that you understand them, as if the specificity of the description is itself important, as if these cities are part of what was lost, and the loss of them specifically, not as symbols, but as physical places with physical qualities, is part of what the Mahabharata is trying to preserve in memory. Indraprastha, the city the Pandavas built on the banks of the Yamuna, on land that was, at the time of its founding, a forest called Khandava, is perhaps the most extraordinary, because the Mahabharata describes not just the finished city, but the process of its construction, and that process involved, from its very beginning, the direct participation of divine intelligence. Indra himself, the king of the gods, who had a specific and particular relationship with the Pandavas through Arjuna, his son, sent celestial craftsmen to assist in the city's planning. Vishwakarma, the divine architect, who is to construction what Saraswati is to knowledge, the presiding intelligence, the one through whom the craft itself flows, personally oversaw the layout. What resulted was a city the Mahabharata describes with characteristic precision as being comparable to Amaravati, the city of the gods themselves. Not inferior, comparable. A human city built to divine specifications, using divine knowledge, resulting in something that blurred the line between the mortal and the celestial, in the same way that the world of Dvapara Yuga blurred that line everywhere and always. But cities are only the most visible expression of a civilization. Beneath the architecture, beneath the roads and the granaries and the halls of learning, there is something else that the Mahabharata describes with equal care: the knowledge system. The Vedic world of Dvapara Yuga was organized around the transmission of knowledge in a way that has no real equivalent in any contemporary society. Knowledge, not just sacred knowledge, but all knowledge, was understood to be alive. Not a static body of information stored in texts and retrieved when needed, but a living current that existed primarily in human beings and moved between them through direct relationship. Teacher to student, guru to shishya. Not in classrooms, not through examinations, not through credentials and institutions, but through the specific intimacy of two people, one of whom has genuinely touched something real, and one of whom is genuinely seeking it. The Mahabharata preserves the names and lineages of hundreds of these transmission chains. It knows not just what Drona knew,
the military and strategic knowledge that made him the greatest weapons teacher of his age. But where Drona's knowledge came from? Who taught Drona? Who taught Drona's teacher? Back and back and back, through generations of transmission, all the way to the original source, the gods themselves. Because in Dvapara Yuga, the chains of knowledge transmission were short enough that they still reached divine origin.
You could trace a lineage of any genuine body of knowledge and arrive within a countable number of generations at a rishi who had received it directly from a god. Think about what that means for the quality of the knowledge. We are accustomed in the modern world to knowledge that has been processed many times before it reaches us. Information filtered through institutions, through editorial decisions, through the successive simplifications that make complex things transmissible to large audiences at the cost of the depth and precision that made them valuable in the first place. We receive, in other words, a very distant echo of whatever was originally understood. And we have largely forgotten that there was an original, and that the original was different from what we have. In the world of the Mahabharata, the original was still within reach. The echo had not yet accumulated enough distance to become unrecognizable. And the people who maintained the transmission chains, the rishis, the teachers, the warriors who were also philosophers, the kings who were also students, understood that their primary responsibility, above all other responsibilities, was to maintain the integrity of what had been passed to them, to transmit it forward without distortion, without the additions of personal interpretation or political convenience, exactly as it had been received. And then there was the relationship between this world and the world above it. The Mahabharata describes, in dozens of episodes scattered throughout its vast length, interactions between the human world and the divine world that were routine in a way that we struggle to comprehend from inside an age in which such interactions have become essentially unimaginable. Gods visited the courts of kings not as apparitions or mystical experiences, but as guests. They ate, they conversed, they gave advice. They participated in the political and strategic decisions of the kingdoms they visited with the directness of advisors who happen to have considerably more information than the people they are advising. Indra visits the Pandavas. Dharma, the god of right action, tests Yudhishthira in person. Surya, the sun god, appears to Kunti and has a son with her that she raises as a human child. These are not presented as miraculous exceptions, events so extraordinary that they disrupt the fabric of the ordinary world. They are presented as the normal operation of a world in which the fabric was not yet thick enough to prevent such contact. The porousness between realms was structural, built into the cosmology, yes, but also built into the actual, physical, experiential reality of a civilization that had not yet accumulated the weight of forgetting that would eventually make such contact impossible for ordinary human beings. What happened to all of this? The cities, the knowledge chains, the direct divine contact, the architectural marvels, the botanical sciences, the city planning, the continuous maintenance of the sacred fire at the heart of every great capital. What became of it? It ended at Kurukhetra. Not entirely at once. Civilization does not end like a light switched off, even when the war that destroys it is of the scale and totality of the Mahabharata war. But Kurukhetra was the wound from which this particular civilization never recovered. The generation that fought that battle was a generation that had been formed by the old world. Their children were formed by its aftermath.
and their children's children, inherited a world in which most of what we have been describing, the living knowledge chains, the divine visitation, the cities built to cosmic specifications, was already becoming legend, already becoming the kind of story that people told about a time before their time. Already, in other words, lost, but not gone, never entirely gone.
Because the Mahabharata itself is a proof of that. It is the record of a civilization that knew it was ending and chose, before the end, to commit everything it understood to the most durable medium available. Not stone, not metal. Story. And story, unlike stone, does not require an excavation to be found. It requires only what you are doing right now, the willingness to be still enough and quiet enough and curious enough to listen to what it has been waiting for a very long time to tell you. Chapter 2. The Weapons of Thought and the Vehicles of Heaven, Astras and Vimanas. In 1945, above the desert of New Mexico, a physicist named J. Robert Oppenheimer watched the first nuclear weapon detonate and whispered a line from an ancient Sanskrit text. He did not reach for Shakespeare. He did not reach for the Bible or Homer or any of the Western canonical texts that educated men of his era were expected to carry in their minds. He reached for the Bhagavad Gita, for a verse spoken by Krishna in the middle of a battlefield that existed, according to the text, thousands of years before anyone in New Mexico had ever been born. The line was this: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." People have spent decades analyzing why Oppenheimer said that. Some call it theatrical. Some call it the natural instinct of a classically educated man reaching for metaphor at a moment of extremity. Some call it something else, something harder to name but harder to dismiss. The instinct of a man who had just done something and recognized in the doing of it that it had been done before. That the territory he believed he was entering for the first time had, in fact, been mapped by someone long ago, in a language he had taken the trouble to learn. The Mahabharata describes weapons that destroy worlds, not metaphorically. The Sanskrit word is astra. It is usually translated as weapon, but the translation is inadequate in the same way that translating symphony as organized noise is inadequate. And astra is not a physical object. It is not a sword or a spear or an arrow in the way that those words suggest. An astra is a weapon of consciousness, a precisely formulated relationship between a trained human mind and a specific force of nature, invoked through mantra, directed through intention, released through a ritual act that could be as simple as a touch or a glance or a single spoken syllable. The Mahabharata describes dozens of specific astras, each one a distinct entity with its own name, its own presiding deity, its own specific range of effects, and its own specific conditions for invocation and withdrawal. They were not invented by the warriors who used them. They were received, transmitted through the same kind of guru-shishya lineage that transmitted every other form of high knowledge in that world. You did not develop proficiency with a Brahmastra the way you develop proficiency with a sword, through repetition and physical conditioning. You received the Brahmastra. A teacher who possessed it
transmitted it to you through a specific initiation that involved not just instruction, but a transfer of something more difficult to name, a direct passing of a capacity itself, mind to mind, in the way that a flame can be passed from one lamp to another without either flame being diminished. Let us be specific about what these weapons were described as doing. The Brahmastra, the Astra of Brahma, the creator, is described in the Mahabharata as a weapon capable of destroying all life in a targeted region. Not just combatants, not just the people or creatures in direct line of fire, all life. The text describes its effects with a particularity that is, once you sit with it, difficult to attribute to poetic imagination. When the Brahmastra is released, the sky changes color.
The air becomes dense and hot in a way that precedes the visible explosion. Animals and birds flee before the weapon arrives, responding to something in the atmosphere that the text does not name, but describes as a trembling, a vibration that moves through the earth itself, through the water, through the cellular structure of every living thing in the vicinity, announcing what is coming before it can be seen or heard. The explosion, when it arrives, creates light comparable to the sun. Not figuratively comparable. The text uses specific language to indicate that the light produced by the Brahmastra was of the same order as solar light, capable of the same kind of damage that solar light in its full, unfiltered intensity would produce. After the Brahmastra, the text says, nothing grows, not for years. The soil itself is altered. The water is altered. The capacity of the land to support life is suspended, not permanently, the tradition implies, but for a period long enough to constitute, for practical purposes, the end of whatever was there. Read that description carefully. Without the framing of ancient Indian epic, without the mythological context, just the description itself. What does it sound like? The Brahmastra is not the only weapon described in these terms. The Pashupatastra, the Astra of Shiva, the most powerful weapon mentioned in the entire Mahabharata, is described as capable of destroying the entire universe if released without restraint. The text presents this not as hyperbole, but as the reason for the extraordinary conditions placed on its use. Arjuna, who receives the Pashupatastra directly from Shiva in one of the most dramatic episodes in the epic, is explicitly told that it must never be used against a human enemy unless that enemy possesses a weapon of equal destructive capacity. Because if it is used against an ordinary opponent, one not protected by equivalent power, the destruction will not stop with the opponent. It will continue outward. The implications of a weapons tradition that requires its practitioners to understand not just how to release a weapon, but how to contain one, how to withdraw an astra after it has been invoked, which is described as often more difficult and more skill-dependent than the invocation itself. The implications of this are significant. This is not a primitive weapons tradition that has been mythologized into magnificence by generations of retelling. The architecture of the system is too sophisticated for that. A tradition that has developed formal protocols for weapons withdrawal, that tracks the lineages of weapons transmission with the same care it tracks the lineages of philosophical knowledge, that explicitly prohibits certain weapons from being used against certain classes of opponent for reasons of proportionality. This is a tradition that has thought deeply and systematically about the nature of destructive power and its limits. That kind of systematic thinking
does not arise from mythology. It arises from experience. There is one episode in the Mahabharata that I want to pause on for longer than the others, because it contains, embedded within its dramatic surface, a detail so specific that it has attracted the attention of physicists and historians of science for decades. Near the end of the war of Kurukhetra, Ashwatthama, the same tragic figure we met in the previous chapter, the son of Drona, whose unwounded immortality was to become one of the enduring images of the Dark Age, releases the Brahmastra in desperation. He releases it not at an army, not at a city, but at the womb of Uttara, the last surviving woman of the Pandava lineage, who is pregnant with the only remaining heir to their bloodline. His intention is total: to end not just the people he is fighting, but the possibility of their continuation; to erase not just the present, but the future. The Brahmastra, aimed with this intention, finds its target.
The child in the womb, Parikshit, who will become the last king of the Pandav line, and the person to whom the Bhagavad Purana will eventually be narrated. The child is struck. The text describes the weapon reaching the womb as a small, intensely luminous point of light. And then Krishna intervenes. With his own divine power, he enters the womb and shields the child with his presence, allowing Parikshit to be born weeks later into a world that has otherwise been entirely devastated by the war. But alive, the only survivor of a lineage that should have ended before it could continue. Parikshit, the text's note, was born already knowing the specific quality of the divine protection that had shielded him. He carried the impression of that protection in his body, in his cells, in the modern language that we would use, though the ancient text does not use that language. He was born changed by what had happened to him before he was born, by the weapon that had found him and the presence that had intervened. What kind of weapons tradition produces that specific a description of what a weapon does to a human body at the cellular level, inside the womb? But the Mahabharata does not only describe weapons, it describes vehicles. The Sanskrit word is Vimana, and the Vimana is, in the literature of the ancient world, one of the most controversial and most fascinating objects ever described. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and the Vedic texts that predate both, describe Vimanas with a consistency and specificity that is, to anyone who has read the relevant passages carefully, genuinely difficult to explain away as poetic metaphor. They are described with dimensions, with materials, with methods of propulsion, with behavioral characteristics that include the ability to move in multiple directions, to ascend vertically, to travel at speeds the texts describe as comparable to the speed of thought. The Vaimanika Shastra, a text whose antiquity is disputed but whose technical content is undeniably peculiar, describes specific types of Vimana with the kind of categorical precision you find in a technical manual, not in a legend. There are descriptions of materials that should be used in construction for their specific properties: heat resistance, lightness, specific reflective qualities. There are descriptions of navigation systems, of power sources, of the specific problems that arise when a Vimana operates at high altitude, and the specific engineering solutions that address those problems. In the Ramayana, the Pushpaka Vimana, the great aerial vehicle that Ravana uses to travel from Lanka to the mainland, is described in terms that combine the practical and the extraordinary in a way characteristic of the Mahabharata's approach to technology generally.
It is large enough to carry many people. It travels faster than any ordinary conveyance. It responds to the intention of its operator in ways that suggest something closer to biological intelligence than mechanical control. And it moves. This detail appears in multiple texts, without visible means of propulsion, silently, generating no visible exhaust, no fire, no plume of smoke or steam. What were the Vimanas powered by? This is the question that has attracted the most speculation and also the most academic discomfort. The honest answer is that the texts are not consistent with each other and not fully clear in themselves. Different sources suggest different things. Some suggest Mercury vortex engines, a concept that appears in multiple ancient Indian technical texts and that has attracted genuine scientific interest for its theoretical plausibility as a propulsion mechanism. Some suggest the Vimanas were powered by something the texts call solar energy, absorbed and concentrated through specific materials and configurations.
And some suggest something that the modern framework has the least purchase on, that the Vimanas were powered, at least partly, by consciousness, by the trained intention of their operators. In the same way that the Astras were not physical weapons, but relationships between a human mind and a natural force, the Vimanas, some texts suggest, were not purely mechanical vehicles, but something more like an extension of the pilot's own body, responsive in ways that the texts describe but do not fully explain, to intention, to attention, to the specific quality of awareness that a trained operator could direct at the vehicle's operating systems. This is the detail that most thoroughly resists the modern framework. Not because it is impossible, we do not actually know what is possible, but because it describes a relationship between consciousness and technology that our current civilization has not developed, and therefore cannot evaluate from direct experience. We can only note, with appropriate intellectual humility, that it is described consistently across multiple independent sources by people who seem, in every other respect, to be describing things they have direct knowledge of. There is a broader point that the Astras and the Vimanas together make about the civilization of Dvapara Yuga, a point that goes beyond the question of whether these specific things existed in the forms described. The point is about the relationship between knowledge and power in that world. In the civilization of the Mahabharata, the most powerful things, the weapons capable of altering the structure of matter, the vehicles capable of transcending the normal limitations of distance and time, these were not products of an industrial process. They were not manufactured in large quantities and distributed to armies. They were transmitted, individually, to specific people who had been assessed as capable of bearing the responsibility of possessing them. This is a fundamentally different relationship between knowledge and power than anything our civilization has developed. We have created systems that can produce weapons of mass destruction, and we have created elaborate political structures to prevent their use, to distribute their deterrent effect, to manage the collective problem of too much destructive capacity held by too many parties with too many conflicting interests. It has worked imperfectly, as we know. The civilization of the Mahabharata approached the same problem differently. It did not try to manage destructive capacity through political structure. It embedded the management of destructive capacity in the very process of transmitting it. The Astra was inseparable from the lineage that carried it, and the lineage was inseparable from the ethical and spiritual formation that made the person capable of receiving it without being destroyed by what it required of the one who held it. When Drona was killed at Kurukhetra, when the chain of transmission was severed at that specific, irreplaceable link, the knowledge did not simply transfer to someone else. In many cases, it died with him. Because the vehicle for the transmission was gone, and the next person in the chain had not yet been fully prepared to carry it forward alone. This is another dimension of what was lost at Kurukhetra. Not just people, not just cities, not just a particular political order or a particular dynasty's claim to a particular throne. A way of knowing, a relationship between human consciousness and the natural forces of the world that had been built up, refined, and transmitted over thousands of years of extraordinary care and extraordinary discipline, and that could not survive the loss of the people who carried it, because it had never existed anywhere except inside those people, inside their minds, inside their practice, inside the specific quality of attention they had developed through lifetimes of cultivation that the dark age that was arriving would make increasingly and eventually completely impossible. The weapons fell silent because the minds that had known how to speak them were gone. The vehicles came to rest because the consciousness that had known how to move them had moved on to somewhere else. And the world that remained had to find other ways to travel and other ways to fight. Ways that were cruder, slower, more material, more dependent on the accumulation of physical resources rather than the cultivation of interior ones, more like the world we live in now. Chapter 3. The people of that age, who they were and what they were capable of. Before we can understand what was lost at Kurukhetra, we need to understand who was lost. Not just the kings and the warriors, the famous names whose stories the Mahabharata traces across its 100,000 verses with such relentless precision. Not just Bhishma on his bed of arrows, or Drona in the moment his son's death was announced, or Karna removing his divine armor as if removing his own skin. Those figures we know. They have been described, analyzed, mourned, and celebrated for thousands of years. I mean the ordinary people of Dvapara Yuga, the ones the Mahabharata does not center, but constantly implies. The farmers who grew grain in soil that still remembered how to be generous. The mothers who gave birth in cities whose walls had been laid according to principles that the builders understood in ways we have since forgotten. The students who sat at the feet of teachers in transmission chains that still reached, within a few generations, all the way back to the gods. What were those people like? What was it like to inhabit a human body in that world, at that time, in that particular moment of the great cycle, after the full gold of Satya Yuga had faded, but before the darkness of Kali had fully descended? To live in the long, complicated, beautiful, already slightly damaged afternoon of a world that was still, in many ways, extraordinary. The Mahabharata tells us, in scattered details, in passing observations, in the texture of the world it describes, rather than in any single consolidated account. And what it tells us is remarkable. Begin with the body itself. The Mahabharata's descriptions of its major characters, and by extension of the general human type of Dvapara Yuga, are not the descriptions of ordinary people scaled up for dramatic effect. They are descriptions of a different kind of human physical reality. Bhishma stands on the battlefield at Kurukhetra and fights continuously for 10 days. Not 10 hours, 10 days. The text does not present this as supernatural. It presents it as the natural capacity of a man of his training and his lineage, applied under conditions of extreme necessity. His body, by the time he is finally brought down by Arjuna's arrows, has received so many wounds that when he falls from his chariot, he does not reach the ground. The arrows embedded in his body hold him suspended above it, creating what the text describes as a bed of arrows from which he continues to speak wisdom to those who come to hear him for the 51 days he remains there, before he finally chooses to let his life go. He chooses. That detail is important. Bhishma possessed the boon of Ichha Mrityu, death at will, the ability to leave the body at a moment of his own choosing rather than at the moment of biological failure. This was not unique to him. It was a capacity recognized by the tradition as attainable through specific kinds of practice, and the Mahabharata describes several figures who possessed it to varying degrees. What does it mean to have that relationship with your own dying? It means the boundary between the self and the body is different than the one we inhabit. It means the identification with biological process, the deep, largely unconscious conviction that I am this body, and when it stops, I stop, has been loosened. Not eliminated, not transcended in the sense of being abandoned, but loosened enough that the relationship is more like a rider and a horse than like a prisoner and a cell. The horse can be directed. The rider can, at the moment of the horse's final exhaustion, choose to dismount rather than to fall. Drona, the teacher of the Mahabharata's greatest warriors, is described as having mastered every form of arms to a degree that the text does not hesitate to call absolute. Not exceptional among warriors, absolute. There was nothing in the martial arts of that world that he had not understood completely, not merely as technique, but as the living principle behind the technique. He could, the Mahabharata says, hit a target in total darkness, using sound alone, with the same precision he could achieve in full light. More remarkably, he could teach this. The transmission of his knowledge was total, not the partial, degraded transfer that happens when a teacher conveys only the form of something they have understood, and not its living root. What Drona gave his students was not a curriculum. It was a direct transmission of a relationship with the art that he himself had received from his teacher, Parashurama, and that Parashurama had received from a chain going back to the divine origin of martial knowledge itself. This is why the test he gave his students before accepting them was not a test of their current skill. It was a test of their capacity for the quality of attention that would make the transmission possible. The rotating fish, the reflected target, these were not demonstrations of existing ability. They were revelations of readiness, of whether the student's mind had already developed enough stillness, enough concentrated presence to receive what was about to be given. Most of the students, the Mahabharata tells us, looked at the fish, the target, and saw both. When Drona asked them what they saw, they described the scene: the tree, the branch, the fish, the eye. Only Arjuna, when asked, said, "I see only the eye, nothing else." He was not lying.
He was not performing focus for his teacher's approval. He had genuinely become, in that moment, so entirely occupied by a single point that the rest of existence had ceased from inside his awareness to be present. That capacity, not the shooting, but the quality of mind that produced the shooting, was the transmission. The arrow was almost incidental. The Mahabharata's descriptions of its characters' lifespans are another window into the nature of human physical reality in Dvapara Yuga. Bhishma was old at Kurukhetra. How old, the text does not specify precisely. The Mahabharata's relationship with time is not always the relationship we would like it to have. But the indications are consistent. He had been alive for multiple human generations before the war. He had witnessed the childhoods of the grandparents of the warriors he was fighting. He had made decisions and taken oaths at a point so far before the events of the epic that his story, told in full, would encompass what we would consider several ordinary historical epochs. And he was not unique. The rishis who appear throughout the Mahabharata, who emerge from forests and mountains and riverbanks to offer counsel, to curse, to bless, to warn, are consistently described as beings whose personal memories encompass vast stretches of time.
Vyasa, who is said to have composed the Mahabharata itself, and who appears as a character within it, is described as having been born long before the events he is recording, and as continuing to exist long after they are over. This is not presented as divine exception. It is presented as the natural result of a particular quality of life, lived in a particular quality of world. The rishis did not live long because they had been granted longevity as a reward. They lived long because the practices they followed, the specific disciplines of diet, of sleep, of sustained meditative attention, of the precise management of the body's vital energies, produced, as their natural consequence, a body that aged far more slowly than the bodies of those who lived without such practices. The text uses a term for this, urdhvaretas, the upward movement of vital force, the redirection of the biological energies that in an ordinary life are expended continuously in the ordinary processes of physical and emotional experience, turned instead toward the maintenance and refinement of the body's deeper systems. The rishis, in this understanding, did not live longer by adding years to the end of a normal life. They lived longer because the rate at which they consumed their own vital substance was, through practice, radically reduced. But perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of the people of Dvapara Yuga, the quality that, more than longevity or physical prowess, most clearly distinguishes them from the human beings we recognize from our own world, was their relationship with knowledge. Not the accumulation of knowledge, the relationship with it. In the world of the Mahabharata, knowledge was not something you acquired and stored. It was something you became. The Sanskrit word jnana, usually translated as knowledge or wisdom, describes something that operates at the level of being rather than the level of information. You do not have jnana the way you have a skill or a qualification. You are it. It restructures you. It changes the architecture of your perception so that you see the world differently. Not because you have new information about it, but because the instrument through which you perceive it has been fundamentally altered. This is why the Mahabharata's great figures know things they have no ordinary means of knowing. Vidura, the wisest counselor of the Kaurava court, understands the moral dimension of every situation he encounters with a clarity that goes beyond analysis or experience. He does not need to reason his way to the right answer. He perceives it directly,
the way a person with perfect pitch perceives that a note is out of tune, not through calculation, but through the immediate, unmediated response of an instrument that has been perfectly tuned. Yudhishthira, the eldest Pandava, is the son of Dharma, the god of right action himself. But the Mahabharata does not use this lineage as a simple explanation for his virtue. It uses it as a pointer towards something about the nature of virtue in that world. Yudhishthira's righteousness is not a moral achievement in the sense of a quality developed through effort and maintained through discipline. It is closer to a perceptual clarity. He sees the dharmic dimension of every situation, the right action, the action that sustains rather than damages the fabric of things, as directly as he sees the physical world. It is not a conclusion he reaches, it is something he notices. What produced these capacities in ordinary human beings, not in the gods, not in the avatars, but in the humans who populated the world of Dvapara Yuga? The Mahabharata points, again and again, to two things. The first is lineage. The transmission chains we discussed in the previous chapter were not only repositories of technique and knowledge, they were shapers of the beings who moved through them.
Generations of practitioners, each one building on the refinements of the last, produced over time a human type that was qualitatively different from what you get when those chains are broken and each generation must begin again from scratch. The accumulated refinement of the lineage expressed itself in the bodies and minds of those born into it, not as inherited talent in the ordinary sense, but as an inherited quality of the instrument. A body shaped by generations of right practice. A nervous system refined by generations of meditation. A perceptual capacity honed by generations of sustained attention to the sacred. The second is satya, truth. Not honesty in the social sense, though that too. Satya in the deeper meaning. Alignment between the inner and the outer, between what a person genuinely understands and what they express, between what they experience and what they say about what they experience, between who they actually are and who they present themselves as being. The Mahabharata is obsessed with Satya. It returns to it constantly in story after story, in teaching after teaching. And the reason becomes clear when you understand what the tradition believed Satya produces in a person who embodies it consistently over time. It produces power. Not political power, not physical power. The power of being in alignment with the fundamental nature of reality. Because reality, in the Vedic understanding, is itself built of something that functions like truth. The underlying coherence of the cosmos, the order that keeps everything in its right relationship with everything else. A person who lives in complete alignment with that order does not have to force outcomes. They do not have to manipulate, persuade, overpower. They simply act from the depth of what they actually are. And the world, responsive as it still was in Dvapara Yuga to the quality of the consciousness inhabiting it, reorganizes itself around that action with a cooperation that looks, from outside, like miracle. Yudhishthira's chariot was said to travel slightly above the ground during the war, unable to touch the earth because his satya kept it lifted. That is the Mahabharata's way of encoding a principle that does not translate easily into our current categories. It is not the assertion that a heavy object floated for no reason. It is the assertion that a person in genuine, complete, uncompromised alignment with truth,
occupies a slightly different relationship with a physical world than someone who does not. After Yudhishthira spoke his one lie at Kurukhetra, the deception that led to Drona's death, his chariot descended. It touched the ground, and from that moment forward, it moved like an ordinary chariot. One lie, one descent. That is how precise the relationship was between inner truth and outer reality in the world of Dvapara Yuga. And this, finally, is what we mean when we speak of a lost civilization. Not the buildings, though the buildings were extraordinary. Not the weapons, though the weapons were beyond anything we can currently reproduce. Not even the knowledge, though the knowledge was vast and deep and carefully maintained. What was lost was a type of human being, a type produced by specific conditions, specific practices, specific relationships between teacher and student, specific qualities of world that no longer exist. Not because human beings became worse, not because of some fundamental failure of the species, but because the conditions that produced that type were themselves fragile, were dependent on the maintenance of specific chains, specific structures, specific qualities of transmission that, once broken, could not simply be restarted.
The people of Dvapara Yuga were not extraordinary because they were special. They were extraordinary because they were shaped by a world that expected extraordinariness, that built it in, that treated it as the normal outcome of a human life lived in full relationship with the sacred. What kind of world would we inhabit if the same were true of us? That question does not have an answer today. But the Mahabharata, patient as ever, preserves the ingredients of one, and it is still waiting for us to be ready to read them. Chapter 4. Dwarka, the city that sank, and the evidence it left behind. In 1983, the Archaeological Survey of India sent a team of marine archaeologists to the coast of Gujarat to a stretch of the Arabian Sea near the modern city of Dwarka. They were not entirely sure what they were looking for. The Mahabharata had described a city there, a city of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary construction, built on the western coast of the subcontinent and eventually consumed by the sea. But the Mahabharata had described many things, and the distance between a mythological description and physical evidence in the sediment of an ancient seabed is a distance that most archaeologists approach with considerable caution and equally considerable skepticism. What they found in the waters of Dwarka ended the skepticism. Not entirely. Archaeology is not a discipline that abandons its caution easily, and rightly so. But what the survey discovered on the seafloor, and what subsequent expeditions through the 1980s and 1990s, led by the oceanographer and archaeologist Dr. S.R. Rao, continued to uncover, was a submerged structure of unmistakable artificiality. Stone walls, foundations laid in geometric patterns too regular to be natural, anchors, pottery, the physical remnants of a city that had not simply been abandoned, but submerged, taken by the sea in what must have been, by any measure, a cataclysmic event. The structures were dated. The results placed them in a range consistent with the Mahabharata's own timeline, somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 years before the present. Old enough, in other words, to be the city that the text describes. Old enough to be Dwarka. What does the Mahabharata say about Dwarka? It says a great deal, and it says it with the same specificity of detail that characterizes its descriptions of everything else
in the world of Dvapara Yuga. The account of Dwarka's founding, its flourishing, and its end is distributed across multiple books of the epic and across related texts, particularly the Bhagavata Purana and the Vishnu Purana. And taken together, it constitutes one of the most complete descriptions of a single city in all of ancient literature. Dwarka was not originally Krishna's city. It was built for him. That distinction matters. The city was designed and constructed specifically to house the civilization that had formed around Krishna's presence, not a capital that grew organically over centuries around a seat of power, but a planned city, conceived as a whole from the beginning, built to specifications that the text attributes to Vishwakarma, the divine architect who also oversaw the construction of Indraprastha. The Mahabharata describes Dwarka as having been reclaimed from the sea itself. The land on which it was built, 12 yojanas of territory on the western coast, according to the Vishnu Purana, was granted by the ocean, Varuna, in response to Krishna's request. The sea retreated. The land it revealed was prepared and built upon with the speed and precision that the texts consistently associate with divine construction. Not the slow accumulation of human labor over generations, but the rapid, coordinated materialization of a city fully conceived before the first stone was laid. What resulted was described in terms that the Mahabharata's narrators seem almost overwhelmed by. They reach for comparisons and find none adequate.
Dwarka was like Amaravati, the city of the gods, they say. But then they add, it was perhaps even more beautiful, because it was built with a particular quality of intention that Krishna brought to everything he touched. Not the cold perfection of divine architecture for its own sake, but the warm, specific, human-aware perfection of something built for love, for the people who would live in it, for the particular quality of life that becomes possible when the city you inhabit was designed by someone who understood, at the deepest level, what a human being needs in order to flourish. The physical descriptions of Dwarka in the Mahabharata and the Puranas are detailed enough to serve almost as an architectural brief. The city was built on an island, connected to the mainland but distinct from it, surrounded by water on multiple sides. Its streets were wide and laid in patterns that the texts describe as resembling the divisions of a yantra, a sacred geometric diagram. Not for decorative reasons, because the geometric organization of a city's streets was understood in the knowledge system of that world to affect the quality of the energy that moved through it. A city laid on sacred geometry was a city whose spatial organization supported the consciousness of the people living within it, supported clarity, health, the specific quality of ease that comes from inhabiting a space that does not work against the body's natural orientation. The buildings of Dwarka were made from materials the texts describe as golden, not in the metaphorical sense of precious, but in the literal sense of color and quality. They caught the light in ways that made the city, seen from a distance at sunrise or sunset, appear to be on fire. Not destructively, the fire of something fully alive, something burning with a quality of presence that goes beyond the merely architectural. The city had gardens designed with the same botanical knowledge the Mahabharata attributes to the gardens of Indraprastha. Trees that bore multiple fruits simultaneously, water systems that move through the city in patterns simultaneously practical and ceremonially significant, spaces of stillness distributed throughout the urban fabric at intervals that the texts describe as calculated but do not fully explain. It had at its center a temple to Vishnu of a scale and construction that the Bhagavata Purana describes with something approaching reverence,
even from within a tradition that already holds all temples as sacred. The primary deity of Dwarka was Dwarkadish, the Lord of Dwarka, another name for Krishna in his role as the organizing principle of the city and the civilization it contained. The temple was not merely the spiritual center of Dwarka. It was understood to be the point from which the entire city's sacred geometry radiated outward, the origin of the pattern from which everything else derived its position and its meaning. Krishna himself in Dwarka is described differently than Krishna at any other point in his life. Elsewhere in the Mahabharata, in the forests where he plays as a child, on the battlefield of Kurukhetra, where he serves as Arjuna's charioteer and delivers the Bhagavad Gita, in the royal courts, where he moves as diplomat and strategist, he is constantly in motion, constantly engaged. The dynamism of his presence is one of the things that makes him so difficult to describe and so impossible to categorize. He is never quite what you expect, never quite containable within any single role or any single quality. In Dwarka, there is a different quality, a settledness, a sense, communicated in the texture of the Puranic accounts of life in the city during his residence there, of a world that had organized itself around a living center and found, in that organization, something very close to its ideal form.
The city worked the way a body works around a healthy heart, all its systems in relationship with a center that was itself in relationship with something beyond it. The divine, flowing through the human, flowing into the structures of daily life, flowing back upward through the devotion of the people who lived within those structures. The Bhagavata Purana contains accounts of life in Dwarka that are almost unbearable in their beauty. Ordinary days, the quality of morning in the city, when the rituals at the central temple began and the sound moved outward through the streets. The quality of evening, when the lamps were lit and the day's business gave way to the particular texture of a community gathered around something it knew to be sacred. People who understood, without being told, that the city they lived in was not merely a convenient arrangement of streets and buildings, but a living expression of cosmic order made available in daily human experience. What would it be like to grow up in a place like that? What quality of person does a city like that produce in the people it raises? And then the sea took it back. The Mausala Parva, the same section of the Mahabharata that describes Krishna's final days, contains the account of Dwarka's submersion, and it is told with a detail and a tone that has always struck readers as different from the epic's other accounts of destruction. There is no battle here, no enemy, no moral failing that brings down the city, just the sea, moving back over what it had temporarily given way for. The ocean reclaiming the 12 yojanas it had granted at Krishna's request, now that the reason for granting them was gone. The text describes the people of Dwarka watching as the sea approached, not in panic, not in the disbelief of people confronting something impossible, with a particular quality of grief that belongs to people who had been told this was coming and had chosen, until the last possible moment, to go on living as fully as possible within the life they had. They had been warned. Krishna himself had warned them in the days before his departure that the city would be taken. He had told them to leave. Many of them had. Others stayed until the water came. The sea moved in slowly, the text says, street by street, building by building. The water was not violent. It did not crash and destroy. It simply rose, steadily, with the patience of something that had been waiting a long time, and took back what had been built on its floor. The last thing to go, according to the Bhagavata Purana, was the temple. It stood above the water longest, its height perhaps, or some quality of its construction. The lamp inside it, some accounts say, was still lit when the water finally reached the top. And then it was gone. What Dr. S.R. Rao's expeditions found on the sea floor off modern Dwarka was not a complete city preserved in the silt like Pompeii. Thousands of years of submersion and the movement of water do not preserve things with that kind of completeness. What they found were the bones of a city, foundations, walls, the structural remnants of what had once been above water, distributed across an area roughly consistent with the dimensions the Mahabharata assigns to Dwarka. They found pottery. Pottery is one of the most durable objects that human civilization produces, and the pottery recovered from the underwater site near Dwarka provided some of the clearest dating evidence available. The styles, the clay composition, the decorative patterns, all consistent with the late Harappan period, the age that overlaps with the Mahabharata's own timeline. They found stone anchors of a type not known from anywhere else on the Indian coast. A distinct design, a distinct scale, suggesting a port of significant size operating at a period earlier than the oldest previously known ports of the region. They found what appeared to be the remains of a massive fortification wall, extending along what would have been the city's sea-facing perimeter. Its dimensions, where they can be traced, are consistent with the Mahabharata's descriptions of Dwarka's defensive architecture. None of this proves, in the strict sense of scientific proof, that what lies beneath the sea off the coast of Gujarat is the city that the Mahabharata describes. The gap between physical evidence and literary identification is one that responsible scholarship does not leap across without extensive qualification. But the evidence is there. The submerged structures are real. The dates are consistent. The location is precisely where the text said the city was. And the scale of what the expeditions found, still only partially mapped, still only partially understood, because the full extent of the site remains largely unexcavated, suggests something considerably more significant than a small coastal settlement of no particular distinction. There is another city beneath the sea, off the coast of India, that commands attention in this context. In 2001, oceanographers conducting a sonar survey of the Gulf of Khambat, further north along the same Gujarat coast, discovered massive underwater structures at a depth of approximately 40 meters. The structures covered an area of several square kilometers. Their organization, the geometric regularity of their layout, the scale of the individual structures within the larger pattern, was unmistakably artificial. Artifacts recovered from the site were sent for dating. The results, announced by India's National Institute of Ocean Technology, and since the subject of ongoing debate in archaeological circles, suggested an age of approximately 9,000 years, which would make the Gulf of Khambat site older than any previously known urban civilization on Earth. Older than Sumeria. Older than ancient Egypt. Older, in other words, than the history books currently have room for. The debate around this site has not been resolved. The datings have been contested. The interpretation of the sonar imagery has been disputed. Mainstream archaeology has been cautious, appropriately cautious, given the extraordinary implications of the alternative. But the structures are there. under 40 meters of water, off the coast of Gujarat. In the same general region where the Mahabharata places a civilization whose level of development, whose cities and knowledge systems and sacred architecture exceeded anything that the conventional timeline of human civilization can account for. What are we to make of that? The Mahabharata never claimed to be describing ancient history, in the sense that we use that phrase today. It claimed to be describing what actually happened in a world that operated according to principles we have since forgotten, involving beings of a kind we have since lost, at a scale of time and civilization that our current categories of history were not designed to contain. Perhaps the most honest response to the underwater archaeology of the Gujarat coast is not certainty in either direction, not the quick dismissal of evidence that disrupts a comfortable timeline, and not the equally quick leap to confirmation of every detail in the text as literally true, but the willingness to sit with the question, to hold open the possibility that somewhere beneath the Arabian Sea, in the sediment and the silence of the deep water, there are the bones of something that was once exactly what the Mahabharata says it was. A city that was built by people who understood things we no longer understand. That was inhabited by people who lived in ways we can no longer fully imagine. That was loved, deeply and specifically, by a being whose love for the people in it was the organizing principle of its entire existence. And that is still there, waiting, as the Mahabharata itself has always waited, with the patience of something that knows it will eventually be found. Chapter 5. Kurukhetra, the day a world ended. There is a field in the state of Haryana in northern India that has been considered sacred for at least 3,000 years. It is not large by the standards of modern geography, perhaps 150 kilometers across at its widest point, flat mostly, the kind of terrain that offers no natural drama, no mountains, no dramatic river bends, no geological feature that explains why, of all the places in the subcontinent, this particular piece of earth should have been considered the axis around which the fate of a civilization turned. And yet it was. Kurukhetra, the field of the Kurus, the place where, according to the Mahabharata, 18 days of battle consumed not just the lives of hundreds of thousands of warriors, but the entire structure of a world. Where what had been built across generations of extraordinary human effort, the knowledge chains, the sacred cities, the type of human being that those chains and cities had produced, was reduced in less than 3 weeks to something that could never be fully reassembled. The Mahabharata knows this about itself. It does not try to hide it. Vyasa, the text's attributed composer, weeps as he dictates. The scale of loss at Kurukhetra is not a background fact in the epic. It is the central wound around which everything else is organized. The story moves toward it for more than 60 books, and when it arrives, it does not flinch. First, the numbers. The Mahabharata gives specific figures for the armies that assembled at Kurukhetra. 18 akshauhinis, a unit of military organization that the text defines precisely, down to the number of chariots, elephants, cavalry, and infantry in each division. Working through the math the text provides, 18 akshauhinis represents somewhere in the range of 3 to 4 million combatants. Modern scholars debate these numbers. Some argue they are literal. Others argue they are symbolic, that the Mahabharata uses large numbers the way much ancient literature uses large numbers,
as a way of conveying magnitude rather than precise quantity. The debate has not been resolved and perhaps cannot be from within the limited evidence available. But consider this. The Mahabharata is not a text that uses numbers loosely. When it describes the dimensions of a city, the duration of a journey, the number of arrows in a quiver, it does so with a specificity that suggests a tradition of careful record-keeping behind the narrative. The numbers at Kurukhetra are part of the same specificity. They are presented not as poetic excess, but as the record of something whose scale was itself part of what made it so devastating. Even if we discount the figures substantially, even if we take only a fraction of the stated numbers as representative of a historical reality, what they point toward is an event of a scale not seen anywhere else in the ancient world. A mobilization of military force that drew from every kingdom of the subcontinent, that emptied courts and drained treasuries and pulled the trained warriors of an entire civilization onto a single field to destroy each other. Who died at Kurukhetra? The Mahabharata catalogues the deaths with a thoroughness that has no parallel in any other war literature of the ancient world. It is not enough for this text to report that many died. It names them. It traces their lineages.
It records their last actions with a precision that suggests these were not invented for narrative effect, but preserved because someone understood that each of these deaths was the end of something specific and irreplaceable. Bhishma, who had been the living continuity of the Kuru lineage for generations, who had been present at the courts of the great-grandfathers of the warriors now fighting, who carried in his person a living memory of the world as it had been at its best, gone. Drona, the greatest weapons teacher of his age, the man through whom the entire martial knowledge tradition of Dvapara Yuga had flowed into the generation of warriors now destroying each other. The last living master of a transmission chain that could not be reconstructed once he was gone. His death, engineered through a deception that the Mahabharata treats as a moral catastrophe even within the context of a war full of moral catastrophes, ended something that had no successor. Karna, perhaps the most tragic figure in the entire epic, the warrior who had spent his life on the wrong side of a question of lineage and honor, who fought with a nobility that the text makes absolutely clear was equal to or greater than that of the heroes arrayed against him. His death took with it a quality of generosity and personal courage that the Mahabharata presents as genuinely unique, something the world would not see again in the same form. And then, on the Pandava side, the next generation, the sons. Abhimanyu, Arjuna's son by Subhadra, Krishna's sister, a warrior of such extraordinary ability that the Mahabharata describes him as having learned the art of piercing the Chakravyuha formation, the most complex and deadly military formation known to that civilization, while still in the womb. He enters the formation. He cannot exit it. He is surrounded and killed by multiple warriors simultaneously, in violation of every rule of honorable warfare. He was 16 years old. The Mahabharata lingers on Abhimanyu's death longer than almost any other single event in the war. Not because he was the most powerful warrior who died. He was not. But because his death was the death of what came next, of the generation that would have inherited the world of Dvapara Yuga and carried it forward. With Abhimanyu died the possibility of a future that would have resembled what had come before. By the end of the 18 days, the Mahabharata tells us that of the millions who had assembled at Kurukhetra, 18 warriors survived. 18. On both sides combined.
18 human beings walked away from a field that had contained, at its height, the greatest concentration of trained warriors, sacred knowledge, and civilizational refinement that the subcontinent had ever produced. The Pandavas won. That is the official outcome. Duryodhana is dead. Yudhishthira sits on the throne of Hastinapura. The dharmic side prevailed. And yet the Mahabharata, which is among other things a text of devastating honesty, does not present this victory as a victory in any ordinary sense. Yudhishthira, surveying the field after the battle, does not rejoice. He cannot. He looks at what has been done and what has been lost, and something in him, that perfectly tuned instrument of dharmic perception that had been his greatest gift, breaks. Not visibly, not dramatically, but the text records the change. From this point forward, Yudhishthira is not the same. He wants to renounce, to walk away from the throne, the kingdom, the victory that has cost everything that made the kingdom worth having. It takes the combined wisdom of Bhishma, dying on his bed of arrows, and the direct counsel of Krishna himself, to persuade him to remain and govern, to do what the dead would have wanted, to try to rebuild as much as can be rebuilt from what is left. What was left? The cities still stood, mostly. Hastinapura, Indraprastha, the other capitals of the subcontinent's kingdoms, they had not been physically destroyed by the war. The fields could still grow grain, the rivers still ran. The physical infrastructure of the civilization was damaged but not obliterated. What was obliterated was the human infrastructure. The Mahabharata is precise about this. It describes, in the books that follow the battle, the specific losses that cannot be recovered. Drona is gone, and no one who remains carries his full knowledge. The great knowledge chains of the martial tradition, which had been maintained for generations through the meticulous relationship between specific teachers and specific students, have been severed at their most essential points. What survives are fragments, significant fragments, honored and preserved, but fragments nonetheless. Pieces separated from the wholes they had been part of. The rishis who had maintained the sacred fire traditions in the great capitals, many of them had died, not on the battlefield, but in the chaos that surrounded it, in the disruption of the supply chains that had sustained the ritual fires, in the collapse of the social structures that had supported the specialists whose entire lives were devoted to the maintenance of those traditions. And the divine contact, the routine, structurally embedded presence of gods in the courts of kings, the transmission of living, sacred knowledge from deity to human through the direct lineages of teacher and student. This had depended, more than anyone had fully understood until it was gone, on the continued presence of Krishna, on his specific, irreplaceable role as the living axis between the world of Dvapara Yuga and the divine order that world had been organized to serve. With his departure, which came not long after the battle, in the quiet of a forest rather than the chaos of a field, the last structural connection between the human world and the divine world that had defined Dvapara Yuga was severed. Not broken in the sense of damaged and potentially repairable. Severed. Completely. The way a bridge is not damaged when the central span falls, but made into two separate things that no longer connect. The Ashwamedhika Parva, the book of the Mahabharata that follows the war, describes the world after Kurukhetra with a restraint that is itself a kind of devastation. The Pandavas govern. Yudhishthira performs the great horse sacrifice, the Ashwamedha, which is the Vedic tradition's most powerful ritual for the restoration of cosmic order and kingly legitimacy. The ritual is performed correctly. The priests are assembled, the protocols are followed, the sacred fires are lit. And it works, in the sense that rituals work. It accomplishes what a ritual can accomplish. It restores a kind of formal, sacred order to the kingdom. It marks, ceremonially, the transition from the age of war to the age of governance. But there is something in the description of this ritual that the Mahabharata cannot hide, though it does not state it directly. The Ashvamedha after Kurukhetra is not the same as the Ashvamedha before it would have been. The same forms, the same words, the same fire, but the quality of the consciousness behind it, the depth of understanding in the people performing it, the living connection between the outer form and the inner reality it was designed to express, is already thinner, already more distant from its source, already, in other words, becoming exactly what the Vedic tradition had always feared: ceremony without understanding, form without substance. The performance of sacred ritual by people who are doing their best, but who no longer have direct access to the living knowledge that makes the performance something more than performance. The first iteration of exactly what the Bhagavad Purana would later name as one of the defining characteristics of Kali Yuga, which was now, with Krishna's departure, only months away. There is a moment in the Stri Parva, the book of the Mahabharata dedicated to the lamentations of the women whose husbands and sons and fathers had died at Kurukhetra, that I want you to hold in your mind. Gandhari, the mother of the Kauravas, whose 100 sons were all dead, approaches Krishna on the field after the battle. She has been blindfolded her entire life. She chose to bind her own eyes when she married a blind king, so that she would not have any advantage over her husband. She has never seen the world directly. She tears the blindfold from her eyes, and she looks at Krishna. And in that look, in the gaze of a woman who has never seen and is now seeing for the first time, in the moment of absolute loss, she directs at him everything she feels. Everything she has held behind that blindfold for the decades of his presence in the world, she could not see. The text describes what happens to Krishna's feet in that moment. The nails, the skin. Gandhari's grief and rage and love and devastation, compressed into a single unbearable look, mark him. He does not defend himself. He does not deflect or explain or apologize exactly. He receives it. He receives her entirely. He receives the full weight of what this war has cost, directed at him by a woman who has lost everything. And he does not diminish it, or reframe it, or make it smaller than it is. He simply stands in it. And then he leaves. There is a question that the Mahabharata asks very quietly throughout its account of Kurukhetra and its aftermath. It is not stated as a question. It is embedded in the texture of the narrative, in the tone of the descriptions, in the way the text treats the specific choices that led to the battle and the specific losses that the battle produced. The question is, was it necessary? Not in the narrow tactical sense. Was there a specific moment where a different choice could have prevented the war? The Mahabharata explores that question exhaustively, and its answer is complicated. Krishna himself attempted diplomacy, fully, genuinely, with the complete resources of his divine intelligence applied to the problem of peace. He failed, not because he was insufficient,
but because the forces pulling toward the battle had accumulated too much weight. Because the web of oaths and lineage obligations and personal wounds and political calculations had become, by the time he entered the picture, too dense to be dissolved from within. The deeper question is larger. Was it necessary, within the turning of the great wheel of cosmic time, that a civilization of this quality produce its own destruction? Was Kurukhetra not a failure, but a completion? The final, necessary act of an age that had developed everything it could develop and was now ready, required, to give way to what came next. The Mahabharata does not answer this directly. It is too honest a text to offer cheap consolation. But it points, obliquely, toward a Vedic understanding of destruction that is not the same as loss. Toward the recognition that what is consumed in a fire does not disappear. It transforms, changes state, returns to the elements from which it was made, which will, eventually, in the turning of the great cycle, recombine into something new. Kurukhetra destroyed a civilization. It also preserved one. In the form of a text so complete, so carefully constructed, so dense with the specific living knowledge of the world it had contained, that the civilization itself chose to die into it. Chose to commit everything it understood to the one medium that fire cannot consume, and water cannot submerge, and time cannot fully erode. The Mahabharata is not the record of a civilization's death. It is the civilization itself, in its most concentrated and most enduring form, waiting on the other side of Kurukhetra for the world to be ready to receive what it carries. Chapter 6. What the Mahabharata left behind and what it encoded for us. Vyasa wept while he composed it. This is not a metaphor. The tradition is explicit about it. Vyasa, the sage to whom the composition of the Mahabharata is attributed, who appears as a character within it, who is sometimes described as the grandfather of the very warriors whose destruction he is recording, wept continuously throughout the process of composition. Not from sentimentality, not from the ordinary grief of a person who has lost people he loved, though that too was present. From something larger, from the specific grief of a person who understands, with complete clarity, exactly what is being lost, and who understands equally clearly that the only thing he can do about it is to refuse to let it be forgotten. The Mahabharata is the product of that refusal. It is, among everything else it is, war epic, philosophical treatise, genealogical record, cosmological map, manual of statecraft, encyclopedia of sacred knowledge. First and last, an act of love, directed at a future that Vyasa would never see. At people living in a world he could describe, but not inhabit. At us, reading his words across a distance of 5,000 years, in a world that has lost almost everything he was trying to preserve, and is only now, slowly, beginning to understand what the loss means. What did Vyasa encode in the Mahabharata beyond the surface of its narrative? This question has occupied scholars, mystics, philosophers, and ordinary devoted readers for as long as the text has existed. The tradition itself acknowledges that the Mahabharata operates on multiple levels simultaneously. That what appears on the surface as a war story contains within it layers of meaning that reveal themselves only to those who have prepared themselves sufficiently to receive them. The outermost layer is the narrative,
The story of the Pandavas and the Kauravas, the war at Kurukhetra, the lives of the extraordinary people who moved through it. This layer is accessible to anyone. It is the form the text chose to take, and it chose wisely. Narrative is the most durable container for knowledge that the human mind has ever developed. Stories survive when treatises decay. Images live longer than arguments. The Mahabharata's choice to embed its deepest teachings in the most compelling story ever told in Sanskrit was not artistic preference, it was preservation strategy. The second layer is philosophical. The Bhagavad Gita, the 18 chapters spoken by Krishna to Arjuna on the field of Kurukhetra, in the pause before the battle began, is the most famous expression of this layer. But it is only the most visible peak of a mountain range that extends throughout the entire text. The conversations between Yudhishthira and Bhishma in the Shanti Parva, the Yaksha Prashna, where Yudhishthira answers the riddles of a being who has killed his brothers, and whose answers constitute one of the most compressed and precise accounts of dharmic understanding in all of Sanskrit literature. The dialogues between rishis and kings that appear throughout the epic, each one a lens through which a specific dimension of Vedic understanding is made accessible to a reader who approaches it with genuine attention. These philosophical layers were not added to the Mahabharata as commentary or embellishment. They are the Mahabharata. The narrative exists, in part, to give these teachings the kind of emotional and experiential weight that philosophy alone cannot generate.
You understand Arjuna's grief on the battlefield in a way that connects you physically and emotionally to the teaching that follows, in a way that no abstract presentation of that teaching could achieve. The story earns the philosophy, and the philosophy illuminates the story in ways that neither could reach alone. But there is a third layer, one that the tradition speaks of with more caution, more indirection, more of the particular quality of restraint that belongs to knowledge whose full implications cannot be absorbed by a mind that has not been adequately prepared for it. This is the layer that encodes what the civilization of Dvapara Yuga actually knew, not as philosophy, as operational knowledge, as the specific understanding of how reality works at the level of consciousness, at the level of the body's vital systems, at the level of the relationship between human awareness and the physical world it inhabits, that made the people of that age what they were. The Mahabharata contains this knowledge in forms that were deliberately designed to be opaque to a casual or unprepared reader. In the specific details of ritual descriptions that appear to be narrative texture, but which, decoded with the right framework, constitute precise instructions. In the numbers embedded in genealogies that seem merely historical, but which carry mathematical relationships of cosmological significance. In the specific sequences of events in certain stories, which mirror the sequences of inner experience in specific meditative states that the civilization understood and cultivated. The tradition calls this kind of encoding Sandhya Bhasha, Twilight language, the language of the threshold, the language that speaks one thing to the ordinary reader and another thing entirely to the one who has been trained to hear the second meaning. It is not deception, it is protection. Protection of the knowledge from those not ready to use it responsibly, and protection of the knowledge itself from the distortions that come when something precise and subtle is translated into forms accessible to those who have not prepared themselves to receive it with the care it requires. The Mahabharata, in other words, is a text with a lock. The surface is available to everyone. The deeper levels
require a key. And the key is not scholarship, not the accumulation of academic knowledge about the text, not fluency in Sanskrit, not the memorization of its contents. The key is a quality of being, the same quality of being that was itself the subject of the transmission chains, whose loss the text was composed to mourn and, as much as possible, to compensate for. This is why the Bhagavad Gita has been one of the most read, most commented upon, most translated texts in human history, and why, despite all of that reading and commentary and translation, the tradition insists that its deepest meaning remains inaccessible to most of those who have approached it. Not because the teaching is complicated. Krishna is explicit about this. He says more than once, in different formulations throughout the 18 chapters, that what he is pointing toward is the simplest thing in the world. Simpler than any technique, simpler than any practice. The recognition of what you already are, at the level of awareness that underlies and sustains all the particular contents of your experience. The difficulty is not in the concept. It is in the distance between the concept and the living reality it points toward. A map of a territory is not the territory. And the map the Bhagavad Gita provides of the innermost nature of a human being is one of the most precise and beautiful maps ever drawn. But it is still a map. The territory can only be entered directly through the kind of sustained, serious, genuinely motivated inner work that the Mahabharata shows us in the lives of its greatest figures, producing the type of human being that world required and that world made possible. The text preserves the map. It cannot by itself provide the territory, but it keeps the map available for the moment when enough people are again willing to use it, not as an object of study or a source of cultural identity or a philosophical framework for intellectual discussion, but as what it actually is, a guide for crossing a specific, real, experiential distance between the surface of a human life and its depth. There are places in India where the Mahabharata has never stopped being read aloud. This is not a metaphor. In certain temples, in certain lineages of the tradition, the continuous recitation of the text has been maintained without interruption for longer than any written record confirms, but long enough that the practitioners themselves speak of it as something that was already old when their teachers were young. The text moves through the air in Sanskrit syllables whose sound, the tradition insists, is itself a form of the knowledge the text contains. Not just the meaning of the words, but the vibrational quality of the sounds, the specific frequencies of specific syllables arranged in specific sequences, doing something to the atmosphere, to the consciousness of those present, that the semantic content alone does not and cannot do. Is this verifiable by the methods of modern science? Not currently. The science that would be required to verify it does not yet exist in a sufficiently developed form. But the observation that sound affects consciousness, that language is not merely a carrier of semantic content, but a physical phenomenon with physical effects, is not remotely controversial. The specific claims of the Vedic tradition about specific effects of specific sound arrangements are the claims that remain to be evaluated. And they cannot be evaluated by people who have not spent the decades of preparation required to perceive what the tradition says these sounds produce. What can be said is this: the recitation has continued. Through the fall of empires, through centuries of foreign occupation, through the replacement of the world the Mahabharata describes with worlds it would barely recognize, the sound has continued. The text has continued to move through human mouths and human ears and human minds. And in that continuity, in that unbroken thread of transmission that is itself a form of the transmission chains whose loss the text was composed to mourn, something is preserved that no physical evidence can fully account for. Something alive, something that responds, still, to the quality of attention brought to it. Something that meets genuine seeking with a generosity that 5,000 years of neglect and misunderstanding and reduction to mere cultural heritage have not managed to exhaust. What does the Mahabharata want from us? It is an unusual question to ask of a text, but the Mahabharata is an unusual text, one that is, in certain fundamental ways, aware of its own purpose and honest about it, in ways that most texts, ancient or modern, are not. At the very beginning of the epic, before the story begins, there is a framing passage in which Vyasa's student, Vaishampayana, is asked to recite the text at the snake sacrifice of King Janamejaya. And Vaishampayana says something that the tradition has been commenting on ever since. He says, "This text is the fifth Veda, not a supplement to the Vedas, not an elaboration of them, the fifth Veda. The one composed specifically for human beings of the age that follows the age in which the Vedas could be directly received, the age of the diminished receiver, the shortened lifespan, the thickened veil between the visible and the invisible. The Veda designed for Kali Yuga, the one that works with what the dark age has left intact in the human being, rather than requiring what the dark age has taken. What does it require? What is the minimum that the Mahabharata asks of anyone who approaches it? Attention. Genuine, sustained, undistracted attention. Not the fragmented, surface-skimming attention of a mind overstimulated by the particular pressures of Kali Yuga, but the quality of stillness that the text itself models in its greatest characters. The quality that made Arjuna, on that morning with a rotating fish, capable of seeing only the eye. Not years of preparation, not decades of practice, not the complete reformation of a life according to Vedic principles that most people living inside the structures of the modern world cannot realistically undertake. Just the willingness to be still, to approach the text, or to approach the tradition, or to approach the question it asks, with a specific quality of openness that is itself the beginning of the answer. The Mahabharata ends as it began with Vyasa. In the Svargarohana Parva, the final book describing the Pandavas' journey to heaven and what they find there, there is a moment that the tradition holds as one of the most significant in the entire text, though it is brief and quiet and easy to pass over if you are reading for narrative. Vyasa appears one last time. He looks at everything that has been described, the golden world of Dvapara Yuga in its fullness, the war that consumed it, the aftermath, the long, slow fade of everything that had made that world what it was. And he says something that has been read as pride, as grief, as wisdom, as all three simultaneously. He says, "I have raised my arms, and I am crying out, but no one listens. Dharma and wealth and pleasure and liberation are all obtainable through what I have given,
but no one wants it. 5,000 years later, we are still the no one he was crying out to. We have his text. We have preserved it, translated it, studied it, adapted it into films and television series and graphic novels and philosophical treatises. We have demonstrated, collectively and continuously, that we find it compelling, that something in it speaks to something in us that recognizes, however dimly, however incompletely, that it is pointing towards something real. What we have not yet done, in sufficient numbers and with sufficient seriousness, is receive it, not as cultural heritage or philosophical inspiration or narrative entertainment, though it is all of those things and more, but as what Vyasa composed it to be, a transmission, a living communication from a mind that had touched reality directly to a mind that is seeking it, across 5,000 years of distance, across the vast gulf of Kali Yuga, across all the forgetting and all the noise and all the ways the Dark Age has managed to reduce the extraordinary to the ordinary and the sacred to the merely interesting. The arms are still raised, the voice is still crying out, and the question, the same question that has been embedded in the Mahabharata since its first verse was spoken and its first fire was lit, and its first transmission was given by a weeping sage to a student who would carry it forward into a world that was already beginning to forget. The question is still waiting for its answer. Are you listening? The text that outlived its world. We began with a map, not a map of roads or rivers or the boundaries of ancient kingdoms, though the Mahabharata contains all of those too, in more detail than most people who have never read it would expect. A map of something harder to cartograph. A map of a civilization that existed before the world forgot it was possible. Before the long descent of the Yugas carried human experience so far from its origin that the origin itself began to seem like legend. We have walked that map together, through the wide streets of Hastinapura and the crystal floors of the Maya Sabha, through the arsenals of a civilization that understood how to draw on the fundamental forces of reality and shape them into instruments of extraordinary power, and that understood with equal clarity the cost of using them without wisdom. Through the forests and rivers of Dvapara Yuga, where the distance between a human being and a god was still short enough that a devoted student could cross it in a single lifetime of genuine effort. Through the waters off the Gujarat coast, where the bones of a city that was built for love and taken by the sea still lie in the quiet dark, waiting to be fully understood. Through Kurukhetra, through 18 days that ended a world, and through the text that world composed itself into in the hours before it passed. Here is what I want you to take with you from this. The Mahabharata is not a relic. It is not a monument to something dead. It is not even primarily a work of literature, though it is the greatest work of literature ever composed in Sanskrit and one of the greatest in any language. It is a living transmission from a civilization that was wise enough at the moment of its ending to understand that the most important things it knew could not be preserved in stone or metal or the accumulated material evidence that archaeologists would later dig from the earth. They could only be preserved in story, in the specific, carefully constructed, layered and encoded form of a narrative that would be compelling enough, on its surface,
to ensure its survival through the dark centuries ahead, and deep enough in its interior to reward with genuine revelation any reader in any age who approached it with the quality of attention it was designed to receive. That civilization was right. The stone cities are mostly gone. The knowledge chains are broken. The type of human being that world produced cannot be fully recovered from any amount of physical excavation. But the text is here, complete, intact, still carrying in its 100,000 verses the compressed intelligence of the world it was composed to remember. Think about what that means. Every time the Mahabharata is read, not skimmed, not summarized, not reduced to its most quotable passages for social media or its most dramatic moments for television adaptation, but genuinely read with the quality of attention that Drona was testing for on the morning of the rotating fish, the world that produced it becomes, briefly, available again. Not as history, as presence, as the specific quality of understanding that a civilization built over thousands of years of disciplined engagement with the deepest questions a human mind can ask. That presence does not require you to believe in divine weapons or celestial cities or the literal existence of gods who walked the earth in human form. It requires only what genuine engagement with any great text requires: the willingness to take it seriously on its own terms, to approach it not as a mirror that shows you what you already believe, but as a window that opens onto something you have not yet seen. The Mahabharata has been waiting 5,000 years for that quality of approach. It is extraordinarily patient. There is one final detail I want to give you.
One small, quiet thing that the tradition preserves about the text itself, about what happens when it is in a house. The Mahabharata says of itself that it should be kept in the home, physically present, not locked away in a library or placed on a shelf as cultural decoration, but somewhere in the living space of the house, accessible, present, part of the daily environment. And it says that its presence in a house, even unread, even simply present, changes the quality of what happens there. This is an extraordinary claim. The text is asserting that it functions not merely as a container of information that becomes active when read, but as a field, as something that influences its environment by the quality of what it contains. The way a window influences the quality of light in a room simply by being there, whether or not anyone is actively looking through it. Is this verifiable? Can it be tested by the methods available to us? Perhaps not. Not yet. Not in a way that would satisfy the standards of scientific evidence as they currently stand. But consider, the people who made this claim were the same people who built cities whose geometry was designed to support the consciousness of the people living within them, who understood the effects of specific sound arrangements on specific qualities of awareness, who mapped the relationship between the inner and the outer with a precision that we are only now, from within our own very different knowledge tradition, beginning to approach from a completely different direction. They knew things about the relationship between information and the physical world that we have not yet caught up to. Their claim about the Mahabharata's presence deserves, at minimum, the same quality of serious consideration we would give to any assertion made by the most sophisticated thinkers of any civilization. The world of Dvapara Yuga is gone. The Mahabharata says this clearly, without softening. The cities, the knowledge chains, the divine contact, the extraordinary human type that those conditions produced, gone. Not recoverable in the form they took. The wheel has turned too far, the distance is too great, but the text remains. And in the text, encoded in the Twilight language of a civilization that understood that the most precious things must be protected by beauty and story, and the particular kind of love that is willing to do the painstaking work of preservation even at the moment of its own dissolution, in the text, the world is still alive, still complete, still in possession of everything it ever understood, still speaking in the voice of a sage who raised his arms 5,000 years ago and cried out to a future he could see but not reach. I have given you everything. It is here. Come and take it. Go gently into your rest tonight, knowing this. Somewhere in the world right now, in a small room with a single lamp, someone is reading the Mahabharata aloud. Not for the first time, not for the last time. In a tradition of reading that has never stopped, that has carried the sound of this text through every century since it was first spoken, that will carry it forward through every century to come. The civilization that created it may be gone, but the civilization it created, the one that exists inside the text, the one that has been living in these words for 5,000 years, waiting for the world to be ready to receive it, that civilization is not gone at all. It is here, in the sound of a voice reading in a lamplit room, in the attention of anyone still enough to hear it. In you, right now, if you are willing.